Hey everybody, it's Party Elite, and today we're staring deep into the eyes of a new decade while bidding farewell to the past. Indeed, the 20s are almost upon us, and whether it brings back Flappers and the Charleston or perhaps the Great Depression, I think it's safe to say that when it comes to strategy games, it has big shoes to fill coming out of the 2010s. I thought it'd be nice to look back at the last 10 years of gaming and travel down memory lane, specifically as it pertains to the genres you'll see on this channel: strategy, simulation, and city-building games of all types. A retrospective list like this is extremely challenging to make. There are so many options, and it's not like I've played literally every game that's released in the last 10 years, nor do I have the time to talk about every single one either. So, if you have any contenders of your own, or any fond memories of your own, or not so fond memories that you'd like to put forward, just please mention them in the comments down below. I'm curious to see your nostalgia in action, just as I am excited to share mine. My plan with this video is to touch on the major releases every year, and give a little bit more detail on the games that made the biggest impact to me, or the genre as a whole, at least in my opinion. Most of these games are positive memories, but the decade definitely had some big shockers and stinkers too, and you cannot walk down memory lane without spotting and pointing out a couple turds. So, without further ado, let's begin. 2010 kicked us off with a packed year. Between Ruse, Supreme Commander 2, Dawn of War 2 Chaos Rising, StarCraft 2 Wings of Liberty, Civilization 5, and Napoleon Total War, it was a good year for strategy gaming. Ruse developers Eugen went on to develop other great titles through the decade, but Ruse itself ultimately disappeared from Steam in 2016 due to expiring licenses, if I recall correctly, and it has since become a distant memory. Civilization 5 is from a series that I don't think needs any introduction, and once all of its DLC released over the course of the decade, I think it became one of my favorite Civilization games of all time, let alone this decade. A solid selection of empires, a good variety of win conditions, gorgeous visuals, and the use of a hex grid system still stand out as memories 9 years later, and I think no rage is as memorable as the AI completing a wonder just one turn before you on back-to-back turns. Napoleon Total War was the end of an era, as the last Total War game to be branded with the era name before the Total War brand name. I just think that's a little interesting. It's the 6th game in one of my favorite strategy game series of all time. Napoleon Total War took the foundations of the less than stellar global scale Empire Total War of the previous year and focused in on Europe during a particularly important time period involving the titular character. Napoleon honed what should have made Empire great and remains a go-to Total War for the fans of gunpowder and cannon fire and empire building in a very tumultuous time. StarCraft 2 Wings of Liberty has to take the cake of 2010 though. Its relevance and impact on strategy gaming and its pedigree simply cannot be ignored. The decision to split the second game into 3 smaller sub-parts still seems ridiculous to me, and perhaps even a failed experiment in release structure, but the game series as a whole remains a bedrock of real-time strategy gaming. 2011, by comparison, was a somewhat quieter year, at least as far as my personal interests went. Tropico 4 took us back in time to our favorite Banana Republic city builder, while Anno 2070 released as the first of the Anno games to explore the science fiction approach to its city building formula. Outside of DRM issues and a rocky launch, the game was pretty well received and probably gave the devs a fair bit of confidence to pursue more Anno games that weren't tied down by history. Stronghold 3 is perhaps a memory better left, well, not remembered. It had a very buggy launch, and though it eventually got a re-release with some updates in 2012, I think it's fair to say that Stronghold 3 simply didn't make much of an impact in a pretty empty year as far as this genre is concerned. We also got Civilization World, which was the Facebook game for Civilization, if anyone remembers that, and Frozen Synapse, which was an indie turn-based tactics game that was quirky and intriguing with a great implementation of a WeGo turn-based system. That is to say, all players lock in their moves, and then those moves play out simultaneously. Total War Shogun 2 brought the Total War turn-based empire building and real-time battle fighting blend back to the Far East and was probably the biggest strategy game of the year. Not only was this the first Total War game with new branding, leading with the Total War name, but it was only the second time the series had gone and made a sequel. Shogun 2 probably remains a bit of a gold standard with some regards as far as the Total War series is concerned, despite being a monocultural, focused game and time period. The game had plenty of replayability, an extremely active multiplayer scene, and an amazing new concept in Avatar Conquest, a concept that Total War fans have wanted back since. Shogun 2 saw plenty of post-launch support and still has a decent number of active players considering its age. 2011 was a strange year. We didn't have all that much, but maybe it was just making room for a crazy 2012. 2012 was the year that brought us Crusader Kings 2, XCOM Enemy Unknown, FTL Faster Than Light, Endless Space, Sins of a Solar Empire Rebellion, War Game European Escalation, and at least 2 pieces of game-changing, life-breathing DLC in Fall of the Samurai for Shogun 2 and Gods and Kings for Civilization 5. It's also the year Clash of Clans launched, if you can believe it was so long ago, and if you're interested in that sort of thing. Now, Crusader Kings 2 really changed my view on what strategy games could be. I never played the first one, and a friend got me into the second one, and while the game makes my wallet cry with constant launches of DLC, it's undeniably one of the more interesting takes on the setting and genre, focusing entirely on the dynasties and characters and the relationships between them. Playing as lowly counts or emperors and kings all had their pros and cons, and there were plenty of things to do and many ways to have fun, with more and more fun being added with each subsequent DLC, many of which changed the very fabric of this roleplay heavy strategy game. Here we sit at the dawn of a new decade, and only now are we seeing Crusader Kings 3 on the horizon. XCOM Enemy Unknown was another big release this year, bringing back to life a series that had been laid to rest in 2001 with a third-person shooter as its last release. Enemy Unknown was addictive, highly replayable, and extremely difficult, and was certainly Game of the Year in my books, as well as the books of many publications. The success has spawned many games with similar gameplay ideas, and thanks to Enemy Unknown, this classic franchise was brought back to life and is being very much kept alive with expansions, sequels, and mods from a very passionate community. War Game European Escalation from the developers of Ruse was another big game changer, kicking off a series with annual releases that created some of the most intense as well as visually and mechanically detailed strategy gaming. Massive battlefields for massive engagements featuring up to 10 players a side, European Escalation had players building decks of units to take into their engagements where every step and misstep made a world of difference. Finally, FTL Faster Than Light is a beautiful, charming, and extremely challenging indie game that has occupied more of my time than I care to admit. Evidence of the phrase, looks can be deceiving, FTL Faster Than Light has you flying a spaceship from sector to sector, engaging in conversations and combat, all while trying to keep the ship's systems in working order and the crew alive and well. Moments of sheer panic and celebratory yells are not uncommon with a game like this, and FTL is still a game I hop into for a quick session or two right up to this year, and it'll be a game I still go back to in the 2020s. 2013 was a year of great joy and horror all at once. Total War Rome 2 was one of the most disappointing launches from the folks at Creative Assembly, while also being one of their most anticipated games. This is a top contender for most disappointing launch of the decade. The new SimCity that released felt similarly disappointing, and this was the last proper SimCity game we got, so it might be safe to say that the franchise effectively died in 2013. On the flip side, StarCraft 2 finally got its sequel in Heart of the Swarm, Company of Heroes 2 released, War Game got a sequel with Airland Battle, and of course, Europa Universalis 4 released as well. Back on Total War Rome 2, honestly, again, it was probably the biggest shock for me. I'd always been a huge fan of the series and its awesome blend of these, turn-based empire building and real-time battles, and I watched the marketing for Rome 2 like a hawk, eagerly awaiting what I thought was going to be the greatest game of the decade come early. Unfortunately, it launched with many issues, and people were not very happy. Over time, with many patches and lots of DLC, things have gotten better, though for some reason, even though I'm on a completely different computer now, I seem to still experience some of the same bugs from launch. The game still has a very active player base, and Creative Assembly continues to release DLC for it right until, well, last year, and it might still stand to get more. Airland Battle was a successful sequel to European Escalation that kept the same design ethos but introduced naval warfare, and StarCraft 2 Heart of the Swarm was, as can be expected with StarCraft, quite the impactful release, with a campaign mode and story of its own, as well as the extremely active multiplayer community. Company of Heroes 2, meanwhile, was mired in some controversy because of its approach to the topic at hand. Either way, Company of Heroes and its sequel still represent the giants upon whose shoulders many of today's similar games stand. Europa Universalis 4, meanwhile, was another big release from Paradox that has received countless pieces of DLC since launch, some better than others. Conquest on a global scale was so well represented in EU4 that I have a hard time not comparing other grand strategy games to it as a benchmark. Be it diplomacy, trade, or war, EU4 gave you reason to play over and over again as different nations with different ideas and different approaches. There was tons of options to explore, and some of the DLC for EU4 completely changed core mechanics for years to come. To date, EU4 remains a game I return to in order to try something different or just to try and take over the world again. 2014 was an interesting year with everything from the disappointing Civilization Beyond Earth and Tropico 5 to games with ravenous followings like Xenonauts, Endless Legend, and Age of Wonders 3 to indie games like The Banner Saga, Banished, and Ultimate General Gettysburg. The Banner Saga was a great example of what the new world of crowd-funded games could be. It was an interesting game with an interesting setting, driven by a great story inspired by Norse myth. Turn-based battles, important decisions to make between them, conversation, character, and camp management, and beautiful visuals to look at while you do it all. Banished was another great addition to the world of city builders, and an indie one to boot. A very relaxing game in the brand of survival city builders, though the dev has left the project. It was left in a good place, though, and it can survive through the community and all the mods and effort that the community puts into it. Age of Wonders 3 was a revival of the Age of Wonders series that had been on hiatus since 2003 or so. This is 4X empire building like Civilization, coupled with tactical battles and role-playing mechanics. Age of Wonders is an award-winning series, and this game was positively received as well. On the flip side, Civilization Beyond Earth, again, one of the bigger disappointments to come out of the decade, if I'm honest. I'm somebody who really enjoyed Alpha Centauri and the expansion for it, Alien Crossfire, as a kid. Now, I was expecting some great nostalgia with Civilization Beyond Earth, but instead, we got a rather bland regression from Civilization 5. The backward steps were very disappointing, and I hope the next time the Civilization formula is taken to space by this team, I hope a better job is done. Xenonauts quickly became a classic with fans hungry for a sequel that is yet to release. An XCOM-style game competing with the revival of XCOM, Xenonauts stood out in many ways, including access to its source code for some individuals, allowing for the community to develop and maintain the community edition of the game. And finally, Endless Legend followed up from Endless Space and brought turn-based 4X strategy set in a fantasy world. With RPG elements and tactical combat, the Endless series got a welcome new addition with Endless Legend, garnering some positive reviews and building upon a solid fanbase. 2015 was quite the year, kicking off what ended up being an excellent second half of the decade. Invisible Inc. was a great turn-based tactical stealth game with a really fun take on the genre. Warhammer 40k Regicide was a thing, and Blood Bowl received a sequel that is still played by a small but loyal fanbase. The Homeworld series was remastered in 2015 as well. I never played the remasters, but from what I hear, they're alright, though they changed some fundamental elements of the original games. Galactic Civilizations got a new release with Galactic Civilizations 3, and StarCraft 2 got its third part in the Legacy of the Void. Prison Architect was a 2015 release as well, and while some set it aside because of its aesthetic, it was quite clear right from the start that Prison Architect was going to be a very complex game with all manner of crazy mechanics at play. The game was and still is a bunch of fun, with some compelling new updates releasing for it to date, alongside the recent acquisition by Paradox. 2015 also saw the release of Attila Total War, the game with visuals that only future hardware could handle at a proper frame rate. Attila seemed to right many of the wrongs from Rome 2, with die-hard fans happily returning to the series, and it was quite a beautiful game, giving the classic Total War blend to a nice new era where a lot of new introductions were done as far as mechanics were concerned that fit the times, of course. You know, the world was burning, so to speak. Now, this was, in many ways, the last true and full historical Total War game, at least of the decade. But there's one game that stands out above the rest in 2015, in my humble opinion. It's crazy to think that Cities Skylines released 4 years ago, halfway through the decade, and still has an extremely active community. A beautiful game and the final nail in the SimCity coffin, I think. Cities Skylines has set the gold standard, no, the diamond standard for city builders. Fluid controls, beautiful visuals, great intertwining mechanics, mind-blowing mod support with a massive collection of mods that take advantage of it, and some great post-launch support on top of it all. Cities Skylines continues to get better and better, aging like a fine wine. From universities to industries to new modes of transit, the post-launch support has been one of a few large steps, with many smaller steps here and there, to keep the game alive and well. Honestly, if Cities Skylines wasn't such an addictive time sink, I'd still be going back to it daily, but I simply can't risk the time sink. 2016 was a special year for strategy games, and on top of that, a particularly special year for me. May of 2016, I started this channel inspired by the pending release of Stellaris and Total War Warhammer, a major shift for the developers of both games. We also saw Homeworld get an actual sequel in Deserts of Karak, literally grounding the Homeworld series with a prequel to the beautiful story of the original set of games. Ashes of the Singularity was a wild RTS that definitely changed how I viewed the potential of RTS games at the time. It honestly looked more like a benchmark utility or a tech demo of the limitless capabilities or something. XCOM received a sequel with XCOM 2, teaching gamers worldwide that 99% and 100% mean two completely different things when calculating hit chances. The game was a beautiful follow-up after a long wait, setting players up as the resistance against alien occupation of the Earth. Clearly, the magic was maintained in the sequel, considering the game was nominated for multiple Game of the Year awards on top of Best Strategy Game and Best Sci-Fi Game of the Year. XCOM 2 is yet another one of those gold standard games that we got this decade. Civilization also received a new addition to the series in Civilization 6, a game that didn't see much fanfare at first, but I think that tune has quickly changed over the years since its initial release. It had big shoes to fill, considering how fantastic Civilization 5 had ended up with all the DLC, and slowly but surely, Civ 6 began filling those shoes. The game did some new things with regards to how cities develop districts, and everything from tech to religion got some interesting work done. And if I recall correctly, Sean Bean recorded a bunch of voice lines for the game as well, which can only be considered a win. Hearts of Iron 4 was a major release out of Paradox as well, bringing a prettier and simpler World War II experience compared to Hearts of Iron 3, and we also saw Anno get another sci-fi release with Anno 2205. The first Battlefleet Gothic Armada released in 2016 as well, alongside some other notable indie games, the Banner Saga sequel, and Off-World Trading Company. On the topic of indie games, Darkest Dungeon also got a full release after a year in early access, a game that has spawned many clones is a strong word, a game that has inspired many other developers, and it's got an art style that's as breathtaking as the voice of the narrator. Darkest Dungeon was the perfect blend of punishment and pleasure. Countless hours of fun and rage made Darkest Dungeon quite a special game, and now it's getting a sequel. It's technically an RPG, I guess, but it's got enough strategy and tactics involved in it to fit comfortably in this list. 2016 also saw the release of Planet Coaster, with its insane building system unlocking the creativity of many wannabe theme park owners. It was a great release. It's one that still gets thousands of active players on Steam every month. Quite the successful spiritual successor to Roller Coaster Tycoon 3. The biggest release of the year, though, in my opinion, was Total War Warhammer. This was a combination of two worlds that fans on either side have wanted since the birth of time. Warhammer Fantasy Battles had previously been provided in Total War through some excellent mods, but now the folks at Creative Assembly were giving us an official game in the setting. It was an extremely simplified game as far as the empire building aspects were concerned, and while there were issues with the execution of some of the new elements, it was great to see Total War expand its horizons with magic and orcs and dwarfs and dragons, though dragons came later, but that's okay. Stellaris only comes second as far as scale of release is concerned. Like I alluded to earlier, it was a departure from the traditional historically tied games that Paradox makes, so it was exciting to see the potential. The Stellaris we play today is almost nothing like Stellaris at release, which just goes to show how far Paradox is willing to push games through free updates and DLC. With all these great releases, 2016 really felt like strategy gaming got a dose of adrenaline injected right into the heart. 2017 was yet another wild year for the genre. Halo Wars, of all things, got a sequel, bringing the Halo universe into the RTS world again, and getting a whole bunch of award nominations across a few years, from multiple Best Strategy Game nominations to Xbox Game of the Year to Visual and Sound Design. XCOM 2 got War of the Chosen, breathing new life into a game that wasn't even close to dead in my books. We also saw Endless Space 2 finally get released, while Northgard, Tooth and Tail, and Oxygen Not Included showed us once more the power of the indie developer. The indie game that stood out the most in 2017 has to be Battle Brothers, a fantastic narrative-driven game about leading a band of mercenaries in a fictional fantasy world. Recruit new troops, buy them gear, and take on contracts of varying degrees of danger in the hopes of surviving and getting paid, only to probably die another day. Wonderfully art-directed and brutally hard at times, Battle Brothers was great fun and received some great updates since 2017 to keep it alive and in people's minds and hearts. Oxygen Not Included is fantastic as well, don't get me wrong, but it was only in early access at the time. Steel Division Normandy 44 came out in 2017 as well, bringing with it the evolution of the wargame series into something a bit simpler to play. By no means a simple game, but certainly not as complex as the wargame games that came before it. That's European Escalation, Airland Battle, and Red Dragon, which I forgot to mention in 2016 in hindsight. Now, we were fighting World War II, focused on the Western Front, and unfortunately without the turn-based campaign map that tied everything all together. While Normandy 44 never quite grew on me the way its predecessors did, it definitely set the stage for future releases. The biggest disappointment of 2017 has got to be Dawn of War 3. While the Dawn of War series is a series only in name, with each of the games feeling and looking drastically different from one another, Dawn of War 3 went in a direction that most fans of the series and of the Warhammer 40k universe just simply could not accept, and not without reason. The visuals were a little too cartoony for most, but perhaps most egregious of offenses were the exaggerated animations. Gameplay felt pretty limited as well, and the campaign just felt like one massive grinding tutorial, and it just wasn't all that fun. It doesn't help that the game released with the clear intention of keeping fan favorite and core factions behind the paywall of DLC, no Necrons, no Chaos, and no Nids at launch. Just doesn't look good. Mistakes were made with the vision of Dawn of War 3, and I sincerely hope Relic is able to recover for a fourth game in the series, because they're fun games, and it's a fun setting, and Relic is good. So I really hope they get the chance to do it again, and I hope that it's going to be a good game in the next decade. And then last but not least, in our talk of 2017, Total War Warhammer got a very quick sequel with Total War Warhammer 2, a sequel that took everything that made the first game good and cranked it right up. Fan-favorite factions made up the core game, and we're still seeing DLC add new options for these starting factions, alongside DLC that adds entirely new factions and wild new mechanics. The devs are clearly having fun with Total War Warhammer 2, much like its predecessor, and the stage is being set for the grand finale of the trilogy to release sometime in the next 2 years, I think. 2018 feels like a decade ago, and it's got enough releases to feel like a whole decade. RimWorld, BattleTech, Into the Breach, Frostpunk, Ancestors Legacy, Mutant Year Zero, Jurassic World Evolution, Surviving Mars, Banner Saga 3, Phantom Doctrine, Thrones of Britannia, Mechanicus, Wartile, Bad North, Rise of Industry, Total War Arena, they are billions. There was a little something for everyone. RimWorld is a game I've been meaning to play for years, since it was in early access, but never got around to it. Fans swear by its compelling construction, survival, and management mechanics, and it looks like a great game where you can easily get attached to colonists and the relationships between them. Emergent gameplay is great fun when done well, and it looks like RimWorld hit the nail on the head. BattleTech was a great release from the year as well, a Kickstarter that didn't just run away with your money. After some legal back and forth with the original license holders and whatnot, the BattleTech universe was brought to us in this turn-based tactical game where you lead your own lance of mercenaries. A little slow in plotting at release, which turned many away, the devs quickly worked to take care of those issues and finessed what ended up being a very fun game that was only improved by DLC and, of course, a great set of mods. New game modes really opened up the options, and new mission types alongside new mechs have allowed for some varied replayability as well. On the topic of mechs, we have to touch on Into the Breach. From the developers of FTL Faster Than Light, this turn-based tactical game pits mechs against kaiju in a beautiful visual style. There's a great variety of monsters and mechs alike, but the real standout is how the enemy always telegraphs the moves it's going to make next turn, allowing you to prepare accordingly. This makes it a bit of a puzzle game, and while it hasn't drawn me back as much as FTL Faster Than Light has, it is still a solid release from Subset Games, making them 2 for 2 in high-quality titles released. Frostpunk is a city builder survival game where you're responsible for the last city on Earth after a volcanic winter begins in 1886. Dealing with all manner of moral dilemmas and decisions, Frostpunk's world was unforgiving and cold in more ways than one. Very well received, with many nominations under its belt, Frostpunk continues to get updates, including a new DLC releasing in 2020 that's being presented as a bit of a prequel. Phantom Doctrine was a fun setting for the turn-based tactical XCOM-like game. The Cold War, an era of espionage and subterfuge, where you could play as the CIA, the KGB, or, after finishing the game the first time, as the Mossad. There were some great ideas in Phantom Doctrine, especially in how intel gathering, agent indoctrination, sleeper agents, and double, triple, and quadruple crossing was integrated. The amount of repetition and generic procedurally generated missions was a bummer, and the lack of post-launch support was really disappointing, but at its core, I had a lot of fun with the game. Mechanicus was a great game set in the Warhammer 40k world, the first in the latest edition of the tabletop game, progressing the story further in time. Following the titular Mechanicus sub-faction of the Imperium of Man, the player is responsible for excavations of many Necron tombs, awakening the ancient robotic empire as they do so. Mechanicus had some great ideas that took the same XCOM-like formula and switched it up with simple things like shots that always hit. No more RNG, now it's all about foresight and being able to spot issues before they kill you. The devs were also very clearly very passionate about the game and the topic at hand, and the game has received a fair bit of post-launch support too. I think 40k fans were happy to see the license get decent treatment. It's a rare occurrence. Mutant Year Zero: Road to Eden was another example of the turn-based tactical combat with a sense of humor and a twist. Real-time exploration and stealth-based mechanics brought the tabletop world of Mutant Year Zero to life with bespoke mission and level design, rather than the use of procedural systems for generating repetitive missions. Finally, of all the games that came out in 2018, and of the ones I mentioned moments ago, I think Total War Saga: Thrones of Britannia deserves a shout. This was an experiment from Creative Assembly, the first spin-off Saga title as they're being dubbed. It was meant to represent a testing ground for new mechanics, focusing on a specific flashpoint in history, in this case the Viking invasion of the British Isles. So this was the first historical title from the Total War series for a while, but it was relegated to this spin-off position, and it was unfortunately not all that well executed. Built on an older engine than the newer Warhammer games, it introduced a bunch of new mechanics that were interesting but shallow. Ultimately, repetitive gameplay and some curiously missing elements alongside the aforementioned lack of depth overshadows the game to date. It has received some updates that have supposedly improved the game significantly, but despite my interest in the era and the series, I just haven't been pulled back to it. With that said, this was certainly an important release for the Total War series, as it set some baseline expectations for the Saga spin-off titles. And that brings us to 2019, the end of the decade, and what an end it has been. Anno 1800 took the series back to its historical roots, bringing its ridiculous complexity to the Industrial Revolution, pitting the player against other industrialists in the city builder / economy simulator / naval warfare game. It was a great return to historical settings, with some great features and ideas alongside a solid but short story-based campaign. Steel Division 2 released as well, and quickly became one of my favorite games of the year, focusing this time on the Eastern Front of World War II, and including the turn-based campaign that I'd expected of the first game. A great deal of fun to play, it made the mistake of releasing without tutorials to welcome new players into the complex net of mechanics, a mistake it's still slowly recovering from, I think. On the topic of mistakes, Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2 had a solid release and was a ton of fun to play. Many improvements were made to the Warhammer 40k space battle game, and releasing with all the factions one would expect was a pleasant surprise. Everything wasn't just locked off behind DLC. Unfortunately, a few bad decisions quickly killed the player base of the game, at least in multiplayer, and now it's a husk of what it was at release, just at the start of the year. Imperator Rome was also off to a bad start, releasing to little fanfare as most were very disappointed in what seemed like a distinct lack of features and the repetition of mistakes that had already been fixed in other prior Paradox games. A few free updates have since released and many improvements have been made to the game, but I think player sentiment is still pretty low, which is unfortunate considering the game stood to bring the compelling standard of Paradox strategy games to a very interesting time period. Tropico received another sequel, this one better than the last foray into Banana Republic city builders, and Workers and Resources Soviet Republic released into early access as a city builder that should actually be classified as a nation builder. Honestly, it's the best city builder I've played since the release of City Skylines earlier in the decade. Total War 3 Kingdoms was also a big release this year, overall a solid addition to the Total War series, the one that really highlights the issues with Total War trying to return to historical titles after the fantasy releases of Warhammer 1 and 2. Despite its claims of being a historical game, it's steeped in enough fantastical things and all of its focus on the romance mode where the main characters are basically gods, it just feels like a barely historical title. It'll be interesting to see where Creative Assembly goes from here. And then of course there was Age of Wonders, which got another addition to the series, this time exploring the possibilities of science fiction as a genre. Age of Wonders Planetfall brings the same 4X empire management, tactical battles, and RPG elements that fans know and love. Many hardcore fans of the earlier games took issues with the setting, but many enjoyed Planetfall just as much as any other Age of Wonders game, warts and all. And of course, one cannot forget the release of Planet Zoo. The folks that brought us Planet Coaster and Jurassic World Evolution have, at the closing hours of this decade, released a beautiful game about managing your own zoo, complete with the attempts at rehabilitation and conservation. The same building system of Planet Coaster comes with the game, allowing for great creative expression wrapped in an amazing management and simulation game. There's some really impressive stuff in Planet Zoo, and while it's getting some DLC a little too early for my tastes, I'll be honest, I'm not surprised. Hopefully, we see some bigger free updates included alongside the release of future DLC. What a decade it has been, and this isn't even all the strategy, sim, or city builders that released. I could probably go on for hours if I decided to cover everything in more depth, but that would probably be a bit much. Like I said before, I'm curious to hear your most memorable moments from the 2010s. Let me know in the comments below your favorite games, your biggest disappointments, the biggest surprises, anything that I missed out on that I should check out. Let me know. I'm always eager to see what other people think. And after that, we're going to put a bow on the decade and look to the future. I've got some videos coming out that will cover everything we have to look forward to in 2020. One could call it 2020 Vision. If you're interested in more strategy, sim, and city building games, make sure you subscribe to this channel for Let's Plays, previews, reviews, and more. As always, a massive thanks goes out to all of my channel members and patrons for supporting the channel on a monthly basis, and a big thanks goes out to each and every one of you for watching. The latter half of this decade has been extra interesting for me with the channel, and since I went full-time just a handful of months ago, I'm looking forward to seeing how it all plays out in the 20s. But I couldn't have done it without you. Until next time, cheers.